Hello guys, and welcome to the Blueprint for Intermediate Users tutorial. This is the second video in my Blueprint for Beginners series where I teach you how to use blueprints, the visual scripting system inside of Unreal Engine 5, and in this video I will be explaining some intermediate blueprint topics such as what are enumerations, structures, and arrays. These are data-driven variables that are essential to using Blueprint inside of Unreal Engine. I will also cover over some of the other things that I skipped over in the previous video, things like what are blueprint functions, what they are used for, and how to create your own blueprint functions. Finally, we will be using all of the things that we learned in the first half of this video to create a simple inventory system that features different items that our character can pick up, and each individual item that we create has its own unique stats and variables, and also the ability to use the item with its own custom logic. So we will create things like a simple health potion that the player can pick up and consume, and it will restore some health to their health bar. We will create this little hatchet item that the player can pick up and equip, and then we will finally create this little book item that will display some text on the player's screen. Now this video will cover all of these intermediate topics, and if you reach to the end of this video and you end up enjoying this free tutorial, you can check out some of my premium courses on smartpoly.teachable.com. If you are interested in making games inside of Unreal Engine, luckily for you, I have a complete multiplayer survival game course where we create a complete multiplayer survival game from scratch. And I will be adding more courses in the future, so chances are if you're watching this video in the future, you can check out my website smartpoly.teachable.com to check and see if there's any new courses. Now this is the second video in my Blueprint Beginner series, so if you haven't watched the first video, Blueprint for Beginners, I highly recommend that you go and watch that video first, as it will explain the bare basics of blueprints. And in the future, I will be uploading a follow-up video to this one titled Blueprint for Advanced Users, which will be the third and final video in the series, and it will dive into more advanced topics in blueprints, things like blueprint interfaces, and so much more. So if you want to stay updated for when that video is released, now is a good time to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell icon. It's completely free, and I'm trying to hit over 100,000 subscribers before the end of 2023. Now without any further ado, let's get right into the video. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create the project. So for this video, we're going to be selecting the third-person character template, and we're also going to be leaving this as blueprint selected. Now I'm not going to include starter content in this video, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. And for our project name, we can go ahead and just rename this to Intermediate Blueprint, okay? And then click Create. So that will go ahead and launch Unreal Engine 5.3. So now that we are here in the editor, let's go ahead and open up our third-person blueprint. So in our previous video, we were messing around inside of the third-person blueprint. So to navigate to there, we just want to go to our content, third-person, blueprints, and open up our third-person character blueprint class. I'm going to go ahead and dock this window up here at the top. Now I kind of want to talk about some of the other variables that we didn't discuss in the previous video, things like enumerations and structures, as well as arrays. So the first thing that we're going to cover are enumerations. So enumerators are essentially user-defined values. So if I create a new variable in here, I can name this to my test enum. And in the Boolean type, we can search for enum. And you can see there are a ton of different enumerators under the enum variable type. So these are all built into the engine. These are different type of enumerators. Now let's actually make our own custom enumerator, because you can actually create your own custom type. So in our content, let's make a new folder. Right click, create a new folder. We'll name this to _main. So that will just send the folder to the very top left. I'll just keep everything organized, and in there we're going to right click, create a new folder, and name this to enums. So in this folder, we're going to open that up and right click, and to create a blueprint enumeration, instead of going over here under the basic asset, we're going to go down to the advanced asset. So under the advanced asset, we have a category for blueprint, and you can see we have the same blueprint class that we have up here, but we also have a couple of different things that we can add. We have things like a blueprint function library, a blueprint interface, macro library, and then down here we have this enumeration. So I'm going to actually select this enumeration. And now I'm going to name this to e_test enum. So now I can double click and open this up. And what this will show us is the enumerator window. So I can add a enumerator by clicking this plus icon right up here. And it adds this display name and the description. Really, you just want to focus on the name. So in our case, we can name this to is walking ? Then we could add another enumerator and we can rename this to is flying ? Add another enumerator. This will be our is swimming ? And add one last enumerator, and this can be is sitting ? So save that. Now if we close out of this enumerator, we can go back into our third person character, select the my test enum that we created, change the variable type from Boolean to e_test enum. So if we type in e_test enum, we can search for that e_test enum that we created. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then we have to compile the blueprint to see the default value. So let's go ahead and hit compile and save. And now we can see we have that default value, my test enum. So we gave it those different options, those 4 different options. And now you can see if we click on it, it gives us sort of this drop down menu. So really all that an enum is a set of different options that you can define, okay? User defined options. So I can select is flying, is swimming, is walking, or is sitting. And basically I can define my own type of settings. So this is super useful because rather than having a bunch of Booleans to store whether or not you're walking, flying, or swimming, you can have an enum that will store, say, the state of the character or other different variables that you might have, and you can just switch between all of them by using an enumerator rather than multiple different variables. Now to actually get this on the graph, let's go ahead and mess around with that. So we're going to add a F key. So we're going to do a F key. And then we're going to get our test enum on our graph. So we can drag this and get this on our graph. And then with this, you can actually drag off here and do a switch on. And you're going to see we have the switch on e_test enum. So if we select that, you're going to notice that it gives us this execution pin. So I'll hook this up for the pressed. So basically, depending on whichever enum that we have selected, the following execution pin will be executed. So for example, I currently have our test enum set to is swimming. So this is swimming execution pin is going to be fired off. So if I were to take this and set this to is walking, this is walking execution pin will be fired off. So again, this is super useful because rather than having a bunch of Boolean variables to keep track of all of these other different states, you can just have an enum that will switch depending on the enum that we have set, and you can have different logic hooked up to that enum. So for example, we could do a print string. So we do a print string for our is walking, and we can rename this to character is walking. Then we could just copy and paste this by doing Control-C, Control-V. And for our is flying, we can name this to character is flying. Copy and paste this again. We can hook that up for our swimming. Rename this to character is swimming. And lastly, copy and paste this one last time. Hook that up for the is sitting and rename this to character is sitting. So compile and save this. So now if we select our test enum, you can see it's set to is walking. So now let's go ahead and actually hit play. So hit play here and press F. You can see our character is walking. Let's go ahead and select this enum, change this to is swimming. Compile save. So if it's set to is swimming, it should print off character is swimming. Let's press F. You can see character swimming. And we can set this to is sitting. Compile that, hit play, press F. You can see character is sitting. Okay. So basically, depending on whatever you set the enum value to, it will switch and execute the following execution pin that you have hooked up. You can also set enumerators. So for example, I could take my test enum and set it. So if I set it on the graph, I can set it like so by hitting this drop down, setting it to is swimming. So just like you're setting any other variable, you can just set the setting here on the graph. So those are enumerators explained. Now, in the other video, we didn't really cover how to actually add a comment to our Blueprint code. So comments are like these little nodes that you can see here, these little gray nodes. So really quickly, to add a comment for our enumeration here, we can just drag over this. So if you select over all these nodes, if you press C on your keyboard, so if you press the C key, that will add a comment. So you can rename this comment to enums or enumerators. And then if you move this comment around, you can see that the code inside of it will be contained, and you can move this anywhere that you want on the graph. Also, you can rename your comment text if you want to, either by double clicking here or selecting it here. You can also change the color of the comment. So if you want to change it to a different color. And then also, if you want to show the name of your comment and have it so that you can see it when you zoom out, you can hit this show bubble when zoomed. So we've covered enumerations. Now we're going to cover the other different variable types, such as structures. So structures are another important data-driven variable type inside of Unreal Engine. And if you're doing anything advanced, such as creating a game or some sort of interactive experience where you need data to be stored, you will likely be using structures at some point. So let's go ahead and create our first structure. So if we go to our third-person map here, go back to our main folder, I'm going to right-click, create a new folder, and call this structures. So double-click and open that up. I'm going to right-click and create a new structure. So under the advanced asset here, under the blueprint, at the very bottom we have this structure. Okay, so let's go ahead and select that, and then we're going to name this to s_test structure. So double click, open that up. Similar to the enumerator that we saw here, instead of adding enumerators, we can actually add variables. So basically, a structure is a group of variables. So what this means is I can add any type of variable inside of here. I can set this to any type of variable and give it a name. So for our test structure, I'm going to change this first variable to a text. And I'm going to rename this to player name. Then this next one will be a Boolean. We can rename the name here to is dead ? Add another variable. This can be a float, and rename this to player health. Add another variable, changes from a float to an integer. This can be our player level. And then add one last variable, and this could be our enumerator that we created. So if I change this to our e_test enum, we can set this to our test enum. So I can rename this to character state. So save that. This is our structure. Basically, we can add any sort of variable that we want, and it will be grouped in this structure. So if I close out of that and go back to our third-person character, we can now add that structure as a variable. So for example, if I go to the variables tab and click the plus icon, I can rename this to character structure and change this from our enum to our s_test structure. Okay, so you can see it's color coded in this blue, dark blue color. So if I compile and save that, in the default value, you can see we have this character structure. So if I hit this drop down, you can see that we have all those different variables that we defined in the structure when we created it. So we can change things in here. So this player name is a text, so I could say smart poly. So is dead is a Boolean, so I can hit the checkbox for true or false. Player health, I could set this to like 100 HP. Player level, I could set this to something like level 25. And then our character state, we could set this to is flying, is swimming, is sitting, to whatever we want it to. So basically that is a structure. The fact that you can create a structure that has or stores multiple different variables can be very useful for things like storing player data or really any type of data inside of Unreal Engine. So for structures, to actually get it on the graph, let's go ahead and cover that. So if I take my character structure, I can drag this on the graph and get it. And you can see we have this blue node here. So I'm going to actually take our F key. So if I click Alt to unhook that and drag our F key down here, let's go ahead and cover how to actually get or obtain those variables from our structure. So if you drag off of your structure, if you drop it on the graph, down here you're going to notice break S test structure. So to get any of the variables, we have to break the structure. So if you select that, what you'll notice is it creates sort of this node that you hit the drop down. It will show all the different variables that are stored inside of the structure. So we have things like the player name, the isDead boolean, the player health float, the player level integer, and then that test enum that we created. So now we can go ahead and actually print out some of the data from this. So for example, we could even do like a branch off of our isDead. So I could do a check, do a branch off of our isDead. So if our player is dead, we could do a print string, print off player is dead. Now if our player is not dead, we could do a print string, and we can print out some basic information about our character, like our name. So we can take our name and convert that to a string and print that out. We could print out stuff like our health. So I could copy the print string again and print off our player's health. And we could even print off things like our level, print that off, add another print string, plug in our level, and you can even print off the character state. So if I copy another print string, if I actually take this enum and drag it onto a string, it will add this enum to string node, which will convert the enumeration into a string that we can actually print off. So now if I hit the F key on our keyboard, it will print off our character structure, which if it's not set to dead, it will go ahead and print off all the information like our character name, the health, the level, and the state. So compile, save, let's hit play. If I press F, you can see is sitting, level 25, 100 HP, and our name is Smart Polly. So I could set this to is dead to true, then it should only print the player is dead. So hit play, player is dead, okay? So basically that is how you can retrieve data from a structure. You have to break the test structure, and that will retrieve all the info from the structure. Now another useful thing is, say I only wanted to get the name, the isDead, and the health variable. I can actually hide these other pins. So if you select this node in the details, we can do hide unconnected pins. And that will go ahead and hide those other two pins, okay? You'd also hit this little drop down default category, and we can enable or disable whichever pins that we want to use for our break structure. So just a nice little neat bit of information to know. Now that is how we can retrieve info from a structure. How do we actually set a structure variable? So let's add a comment for this. This is press C on your keyboard, that will add a comment. This will be called break structure equals retrieve info from a variable. So how do we actually go ahead and set a structure? So to set a structure, you can get your character structure, drag it on the graph, and do a set character structure. But instead of breaking a structure, if you drag off of this character structure, you can do a make structure. So we have the make and we have the break. So the break is to retrieve value, the make is to set the values. So just like this other node over here, we can select it and hit this drop down, and you can see we can set all the variables inside of the structure. So for example, I could set our player name to Joe. I could set his player health to 20, player level to 1, and I could set his state to swimming. So if we actually take this and move this up here, so if I move our comment over, I could unconnect our F key by clicking the Alt to break that, then hook up our set before our break. So now if I set the variable to this new info, so we're going to change the default value to Joe, player health 20, player level 1. If I make that structure, then break it, we should see the new info when I press F. So hit compile and save. Okay, so we're getting a enum to string has invalid value. Okay, so because I unhooked this enum to string, it's giving us this error. So actually, let's hook this back up. So character state, hook that up, player level, hook that up, hit compile and save, and now that error went away. So now let's go ahead and play test this out by hitting play. Press F. You can see our name is Joe. Our health is 20. Our level is 1, and we're set to is swimming. So that is really how you can set a structure or set the values inside of a structure by doing the make structure. Now there is one other way to set variables inside of a structure. It is a little bit more advanced, but basically what we can do is get our character structure, and there's this node called set members. So you can do the set members in test structure. And this node looks very similar to these other nodes over here, but instead of making or breaking it, you're setting the values inside of here. So under the default category, if you have this selected, you can set pins that you want to set, and that will go ahead and give you the struct out, which we then want to go ahead and do a set. So set character structure, plug that struct out into that variable. So this is sort of like the make, but instead of making or changing all the different variables inside of here, we can select which variables that we want to actually modify. So for example, if I only wanted to modify the player name, I could change this to Joe. And then I could disconnect this, delete that, and plug this up here to our F key. So we're getting our character structure, we're setting the member or the variable player name to Joe. We're setting that, and now we're going to break that and print it out. So now let's go ahead and hit play, press F. You can see it's printing off player is dead. So we need to go back to our character structure and uncheck that. So uncheck the is dead variable there. So go back and hit play. So you can see our name is now set to Joe. Our HP is 100, our level is 25. All those other variables are still saved, whereas the only variable that we set was Joe. So the set members allows you to modify variables inside of a structure, the only variables that you want to modify. So this is very different than the make structure. Now those are the basics to structures and enumerations. Now the last thing that we're going to cover are arrays. So if you go over to the variables, we're going to create a new variable and name this to array of player names. So we're going to change this from a structure down to a string. Hit compile and save. And then if you hover over this variable type, you can see this little icon over here to the right of it. If you hit this drop down, we have a single type, which is currently what we have it to. You can see it's one string. We can hit this drop down and change it to an array. So now we have to hit compile. And now what you're going to see is we have this default value array of player names, and we have 0 array element. We also have this plus icon and this trash or delete icon. So basically what an array is sort of like a collection of variables. So in our case is a collection of strings. So I can click this plus icon and you can see it adds one string or one array element. So in our case we could rename this to John. We could add another array element. You can see it adds index 0, index 1. I can rename this to Joe. And basically we can use this array of player names to store a list of names. Okay, so you can think of this sort of as like a list. So I can name this John, Joe, Bob. Could add another variable. This could be Smart, Polly. Add another variable, and this could be Ben. So compile, save that. We have sort of this array or this list of player names. So one thing to note about arrays is that they start at the number 0. So basically it starts index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you see there are 5 array elements, but this is index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, and index 4. Okay, so you want to always note that arrays start at index 0. So now to actually get this array on our graph, if we drag this onto our graph, we can get array of player names. And you can see we have this square array icon, similar to what we see over here on our variable type. Now to actually get our player names, let's say we want to add some basic logic to print off all of the player names to our screen. So the way that we could do that is off of our array, we can do a for each loop. So under this utilities array, we have these different nodes that we can use. And we have this for each loop node. Okay, so if I select that, what this is going to give us is this for each loop. So what the for each loop does is for each of the array elements, we can plug in some logic to the loop body and it will output each individual array element. For this execution, let's actually hook up a key. So I'm going to type in the E key. So the E key on our keyboard. So let's select that keyboard event, hook that up for our pressed. And then for this loop body, we can add a print string. So this loop body will get fired off every single time for each array element. So for this array element, we can plug this into the string, and that will go ahead and print off for each of the player names. It will print off every single name. It will print off John, Joe, Bob, Smart Polly, and Ben. We also have this array index, which will print off the index at where that name is. So for example, for John, that will be index 0. For Joe, that will be index 1, okay? And so on. And then once it's complete, it will execute this completed node. So I could drag off here and do a print string, and we can name this to those are all the names in our array. So we'll just know that this loop completed through printing all the names, and then we printed off basically that we completed printing off all the names. So now let's go ahead and test this out. So if we press E on the keyboard, it should start printing off all of the names that we have in our array. So if I hit play, press E, you can see that it printed off all of the names. So we have John, Joe, Bob, Smart Polly, Ben, and you can see those are all the names in our array. So basically what this is doing is it's looping for each of the names and is calling our print string for each of those, continues to loop until the array is complete, and then it will call the completed string. So that is how you could print off or loop through all of the variables inside of an array. You could also get individual array elements. So for example, if I were to get my array here on the graph, if you drag off here, you can do a get, and you can see we have array, get a copy, and get a reference. So I'm going to go ahead and do get a copy. And now what you're going to see is we have this get node where basically we can specify an index and that will return an output. So let's go ahead and take our E key and unhook that by pressing Alt, and then hook this up to a print string, and then hook that up for our pressed. So when we press the E key, that will get from our player name array at index 0. Okay, so currently this is set to index 0. So what that should print is the name John. So if I hit compile and hit play, I press E, you can see it prints off John because John is the name at index 0. So if I set this to index 1, I can hit compile and save and press play. If I press E, you can see that prints off Joe because Joe is the name at index 1. So I could change this to index 3. You can see index 0, 1, 2, 3. Number 3 here is set to Smart Polly. So if we get at index 3, it should print off Smart Polly. So I hit compile, hit play, press E. You can see it prints off Smart Polly. So that is how you would get a specific index in the array by using the get node. Now moving on, you could even modify this logic to get a random name. So for example, if I wanted to get a random name in this array, one way that we could do that is we can modify what we have set up here by doing a random integer in range. So if we drag off this, we could do a random integer in range, and then we could specify a range to select a random integer. So for example, our array starts at index 0 and goes all the way up to 4. So we could leave this as a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 4. Or we could also get the length of this array. So there's also another node if you drag off this array called length. So if you get the array, you can get the length of that array. And that will return the length of this array, which in our case should be 5 array elements. Now if you were to plug this into this random integer, that will allow it to pick an index outside of the array values. So for example, this will print off 5. So if I hook this up into our in string, if I compile and save and press play, press E, you can see that the length of our array is 5. But if we want to get a random integer from our array, we want to have a range from 0 to 4. So one way that we could do that is we could do a subtract. So operator subtract, and just subtract our length by 1, and then hook that up for our maximum value. So now it should be a range from 0 to 4. And what this will do is it will get a random name in our array and print it off to our screen. So I press play and press E. You can see Smart Polly, Joe, Bob, Bob again, Joe again, John. So you can see it just randomly picks a name and prints it off to the screen. So that is how you could do sort of a random integer within the range of an array. Now we've gone over how to get array elements. Let's actually go over how to set array elements. So there are a couple of different ways that you can add array elements or set them. So down here below this, let's actually add a comment for this. This can be, just for each loop, print off each player name. And then this is our print a random name from our array. So for setting array elements, if we go down here, we can actually get our array of player names, and we have a node called the add node. So if we drag up there and do a add, we have this array add. Now what the add node does is exactly what it sounds like. It will add another array element. So for example, I could name this to test, and then I could hook up a key to print this off. So if I add the F key, so I believe we're using the F key all the way up here, I'm going to unhook that and drag this down here. So when I press the F key, we'll go ahead and add that to our array. And then we could also do a get. So I could get my array of player names and do a get array get a copy, and we can get it at that index, because you see it returns this index of where it's being added in that array. So if we get at that index from our array, we can get that exact value that we added. So then we can do a print string and hook that up like so. So if I compile and save, if I press the F key, that will go ahead and add test to our array, and then we can go ahead and print that string from that array index. So I press F, you can see it printed off test because it added that array element to our array, and we're getting it at that array element and printing it off. So really those are the basics of arrays. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much, but you can essentially get from arrays the values. You can also add more values to arrays. Later on in the video, I'm going to cover over how to actually set specific indexes in the arrays. But basically, arrays are very useful for storing data because you can store a group of variables. You can even change this to array of booleans, array of integers, array of floats, really any other type of variable. You can even change this to an array of structures. So for example, I could add another variable, and this will be our player array, and I could change this from a string variable to that s_test structure that we had, and you can see we now have an array of those structures. So hit compile, save, we have this player array. So if I hit add array element, you can see that it added this index 0, and we can expand this, and now we have this player array where I can add player name Joe. You can set whether or not is dead is true or false. We can set the player health, the player level, the character state. Then we have this index 1. We can also change this to Smart Polly, change the is dead, player health, the level, and a character state. We can even add more array elements. Now if you wanted to actually delete array elements, we could select this, hit this little down arrow and click delete, and that will delete array elements. Okay, if you were hit to this delete, that will remove all array elements. That will just delete everything out of the array. So arrays are super useful for storing data because you can store things like player info, stats, or really any variable type. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next part of this video where I want to talk about functions. So in our previous video, the blueprint for beginners, I didn't really talk about functions and what they are. So I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to cover over what are functions and how to use them. So first of all, a function, if you look in your blueprint tab down here, we have this functions section. So just like variables, we can add new functions by clicking this plus icon. And first of all, let's go ahead and actually talk about what are functions. So if you actually look really closely here on the graph, a function is sort of like this node right here. So this is a function because you can see that it has this F logo right there, or that little F icon. This is a print string function. There are more other different types of functions. So for example, this random integer in range, this is also a function because you can see that little F logo. So print string and random integer in range, these are all functions. So even the character input up here are functions. So for example, we have this jump. This is also a function. So functions are sort of like these different nodes that can contain logic inside of them. So for example, we can actually create our very first function. So under the functions, I can click this plus icon. And what that will do is it'll create a new function. So I'm going to leave that as new function. So if you click on the graph, that will go ahead and finalize the name there. So you can see it says new function. We are in this function graph. So I scroll in and out, it's the same as the normal event graph. I can change tabs between the event graph and our new function. So the function sort of gives us its own blueprint graph that we can put our own blueprint nodes and logic inside of. And now we have that function over here on the left. So for example, for our new function in here, it gives us this execution pin. So we could drag off here and do a print string, and we can print off some info to our screen. So we can print off a little text saying, this is my first function. So if we hit compile and save, we can go back to our event graph, and then off of our F key, what we can do is delete all that and call this function. So I drag off this, I can call it on the graph. I could also call our function by right-clicking and searching for new function. And you can see call function and new function. So this is our new function. So if I plug this into our isPressed, so I press the F key, it will call this new function. If you double click it, it will open it up. So you can either navigate by double clicking the function over here, that will pull it up. You can change to the tab over here, or you can double click the node and that will open up the function. So basically when we call this function, it should print off, this is my first function. So when I press the F key, it will call that function and print, this is my first function. So if we hit compile and hit play, press F, you can see this is my first function. So really a function allows you to store blueprint logic inside of it. And this can actually be very useful for if you are going to be reusing a node multiple times. So for example, if I have a bunch of logic that I'm going to be reusing multiple different times, I can put that logic inside of a function, and then I can just copy and use the function wherever I need on the graph, rather than copying, say, a group of nodes over and over. And this will help a lot with organization and also with optimization, because rather than having a bunch of nodes on your graph, you can just have a function that calls all those nodes. That way you don't have to have all those nodes copy and pasted in multiple different locations. So functions also have different types of settings, and they can also input values and output values. So for example, if I were to double click and open our function, I can select this purple new function node, and in the details here we have some settings. So what we want to focus on first is the inputs and outputs. So first let's go ahead and add an input. So I click this plus icon on the input. That will allow us to add an input variable. So we can pass information from outside of the function to the inside. So for example, I could change this to a string. We could name this to player name, compile and save. And then we can hook this string up to our print string. And now if we go to the event graph, you can see that we now have this input player name, where we can either type in here Smart Poly or the name of your player, or we can even hook it up to a string variable, okay? So we can add inputs to the function, which then passes that variable inside of here, which we can then use to do whatever we need to do inside of the function. So if I pass the player name Smart Poly into this function, we'll go ahead and take that name and print it to the screen. So if I hit play and press F, you can see that it prints Smart Poly. So that is how you would add things like inputs. You could add many different types of inputs, but you can also add outputs. So for example, I could delete this input, and once you delete inputs like this, you can see that gives us this error. So if you press Alt and click on that, it will remove that pin, and you can see it's no longer giving us that error. So I can hit compile and save. So I can add more different types of inputs. So I could come in here, select that, and add another input. I could change this to a float and rename this to damage. And I could also add another variable and rename this to health. And then we could add an output value by adding an output. And what you're going to see is it adds this output variable, but also this return node with that output variable. So I can rename this variable to out health or health after our damage. And I could take this return value and plug this into our execution pin flow. So basically, we're going to get our health and do a subtract that by the amount of damage. And then we can plug this into our out health. We can even delete this print string and plug it in like that. So basically this function is taking a health variable, subtracting that by the amount of damage that we take, and then returning the out health as a output. So we head to the event graph, you can see that we now have those inputs and outputs. So for example, I could give our health a value of 100 HP. I give our damage, say 30 damage. And then for our out health, we could do a print string and hook up our out health to the string. And that should print out our health minus the damage and print it out, okay? So if I hit compile and save and hit play, if I press F on my keyboard, you can see that our health is 70 because our health is 100 minus 30, which equals 70. So it's running through that function. We have things like inputs, and we also have things like outputs. So really those are the basics of functions. The fact that you can store blueprint logic inside of functions and call them on the graph will be very useful, especially for reusing bits of logic that you might want to reuse in a couple of different places on your graph. Okay, so now we're going to actually pivot the tutorial so that we can go ahead and actually work on our inventory system. So basically we're going to create 3 different items that we can actually pick up, and we're going to have a simple inventory hotbar on our screen, and we're going to use all of the things that we just learned, things like enumerations, structures, arrays, as well as functions to program the entire thing together. So let's go ahead and start working on that. So if you head back over to your content drawer, I'm actually going to dock this in layout and then go to our main folder. And the first thing that we're going to need to create is a enumeration for our item types. So open up your enums folder and we're going to right click and create a new blueprint enumeration. So this will be called e_item type. So our item type enum. So double click, open that up, and dock this up here at the top. So for the enumerator, we're going to add 3 different enumerators in here. And the first one will be called consumable. And the second one will be equipable. And the last one will be called readable. So basically these are the 3 different item types. And depending on the item type that we set, it will do different logic, okay? So consumables, that will consume like a potion that will restore health. Equipables, that will equip like an item, like a hatchet to our hand. And then a readable will just show some text on our screen that the player can read. So we're just using that enum so we can switch on those different item types, okay? So let's go back to our content browser and back to our main folder. Now we need to create a structure that will hold all of the item info. So in our structures, we're going to right click, create a new blueprint. Under the blueprint section, we're going to go down to structure, select that. This will be called s_item structure. So just double click, open that up. And we're going to add a couple of different variables in here. The first one being that enumeration that we just created. So this first one, let's change this to that e_item type. So we have e_item type. And we're going to rename this to item type. Okay. So save that, create a new variable. This will be set to a static mesh. So we want to search for static mesh. And then if you hover over static mesh, you're going to have these different options. What we want is a object reference. Okay. So if you select static mesh, you want it to be object reference or this blue color right here. So this, if we rename the name on here, this will be called just mesh, the mesh of the item. Add a new variable. We're going to change this one to an integer, and then rename this to damage. Okay, so this will be how much damage this item can do. And then we're going to add another variable. This one will be a text, and we can rename this to item name. Okay, so this will be the name of the item. Add another variable. We're going to change this from a text to a texture 2D. So if you look down here, we have texture 2D. And again, we want to set this to an object reference. So select object reference. So rename that one to item icon. So that will be like the user interface icon of this item. And then add another variable, and this will be a text. And we'll rename this to item text. Okay. So if we have any, details or description, or even if this is an item readable type, like a note, we could put that inside of this item text variable. Okay, so that is our item structure. We will be adding one last variable inside of here, but we'll come back to that later. So this is now complete. So if we close out of that, we now have the basic data types for our inventory system. So we created that enumeration, the item types, and then we created our structure, the item structure. So now what we need to do is we need to create the actual blueprints for our blueprint items. So we're going to right click in our main folder, create a new folder, and we're going to name this blueprints. And double click them and open that up. And we're going to add a blueprint class inside of here. So we just want to right click and add a new create basic asset blueprint class. And it's going to have us select a parent class. And so in our case, we're going to pick the actor class. So select that and rename this to BP_item master. So it is our master item. Now double click and open this up and dock this up here at the top. And inside of this blueprint, we're going to add that item structure that we created. So in the variables, we want to click on the plus icon and just rename this to item info. Then we want to change it from a Boolean to our s_item structure. So compile and save. And now if you have that item info selected in the details, if we expand the default value, we have all of those variables that we can change. So we can change things like the item type, if it's a consumable, equipable, or readable. We can set stuff like the static mesh or the item mesh. We can set the damage of the item name, the item icon, and then also the item text. Now we're actually not going to be setting this variable inside of the master class. We're going to be setting it in the children class. And we're going to go over that here in a second. But the other thing that we want to add inside of here is we want to add a collision sphere so that we can overlap with it and actually pick up the item. And then we're going to add a static mesh component so that we can actually see the mesh that we want to pick up. So in our components tab, the first thing that we want to add is our sphere collision. So I have collision, sphere collision. And then also you want to select the default scene root, and then on top of that add our static mesh. Okay, so they should be side by side like this. Okay, then I'm going to take this sphere collision and scale this up. So I believe I scale this up to about 6.5, and then for the static mesh we can just set this to a simple mesh. So select the static mesh component, and in the static mesh in the details panel we can set this to a cube. or actually set this to this cube 1. Okay, so this little mesh. Then we can actually take this and scale this down. So I'm going to scale that down to 0.75. So compile and save that, and now we can actually drag this item master blueprint into our level. So we can drag that in there. So this will be our simple item pickup that we can overlap with the sphere, and we can actually pick it up. Now we don't want to set any of the variables inside of the master class. Like I said, we want to make a child class where we can actually set all of the info inside of. So to create the children blueprint or the children classes, basically we don't want to duplicate this BP item master, because let's say we wanted to add multiple different types of items. If we actually go ahead and duplicate this blueprint, that means that we have to set up the interaction logic per each individual item. And let's say we have, hundreds of items, maybe even thousands of items in our game. It's just not going to scale well with performance because of having all that logic duplicated, rather than having a single class that has the logic and then all of the other classes sort of use that single logic. Okay, so this is where having a master class and a child class comes in handy. So first, to create the actual child class, if you right click over the blueprint, so our blueprint item master, at the very top we have blueprint class actions, and we can create this child blueprint class. So if I click on that, now it's going to add this BP item master underscore child, and I can go ahead and actually rename this to BP underscore item book, and then we can go ahead and double click and open this up. So what you're going to notice inside of here is it pretty much looks the exact same as our item master. So you can see it has the cube in here, it has the sphere, but inside of our BP item book, the main thing that you need to note is that it inherits the same variables and the same components as in our item master. So what that means is in our item book, you can see we have the cube and the sphere. We also have our item variable. So you're not going to see it under the variables tab, the item info. But if you head over to the class defaults, under the details, if you click class defaults, we have this default tab, and you can see we have that item info. So if you expand that, you can now see we have that item info structure variable that we had inside of our item master. So whenever you create variables inside of the master blueprint, in the child blueprint, the variables will show underneath the class defaults. They won't show anywhere inside of here. Also, another thing with the children class is you're going to notice the parent. So up in the top right, you can see parent class is our BP item master, which is master class. Now, the reason why we want to use a master and a child class is because I can change all of the values of this item book class. So I could change the mesh, select this static mesh, and change it to, say, this cone. So compile, save that, and then if I browse and drag this into our level, you can see we have this different mesh. Now if I were to change any of the settings inside of our item master, so for example if I were to add the pickup logic and all that stuff inside of here, it's going to update for our other children classes like our item book and our other types of items. So it's going to make it a lot easier. It's going to save us time having to program the interaction. And also it's the preferred method for designing complex blueprint systems inside of Unreal Engine. Now this children and master class is also called inheritance. And again, what that means is any of the changes inside of the master class will be inherited by the children classes. So if I were to reset this cone back to the cube in the item book, if I go into our item master, I could select the cube, and in here, if I change it to a different mesh, let's say this editor sphere, if I compile and save that and I go back into our item book or in the children class, you can see that it's inherited that change from our master. So basically the children class inherits any changes or any updates and really all of its properties from the parent class or the item master. Okay, so I'm going to set that back. Now this is also very true in Unreal Engine itself, the way that the engine is designed. So what I mean by that is if you go into your content folder and right click inside of here, and under the create basic asset, if we select blueprint class, you're going to notice this says pick parent class. So in Unreal Engine, they already have a type of parent and child class set up with their Blueprint system. So in Unreal Engine, the first thing that you have is called an object. So an object is basically something that can exist in Unreal Engine. Then from the object, you have an actor. So an actor is an object that can be placed or spawned in the world. Then from the actor, you have sort of this pawn. So the pawn sort of inherits the actor's ability to be placed or spawned in the world. But what the pawn class has is additional logic that can receive input from a controller. So it can be possessed and receive input. Now the character is also a type of pawn, so it inherits the pawn's ability to be possessed and move around, but it also has some additional logic for its ability to walk around. So you can sort of see the type of inheritance in the parent and children classes inside of Unreal Engine just from this blueprint creation screen. Now that is basically Inheritance 101. Let me know if you need any clarification in the comments down below. But now let's go ahead and actually set up all of our children blueprints or our item types. Things like our item book. So for that, we're going to need to import the assets. So I want to head over to the description of this video and download the project files for this video. And in the main folder, we're going to right click and create a new folder called Resources. And so once you download the project files, you just want to right click the zip file and click Extract All. And then once you've extracted the files, we'll have this project files folder. We have some 3D models, and we also have some icons. So first things first, we created that content main resources folder. So let's right click, create a new folder in here, call this item icons. Then double click, open that up. And in our project files, we have icons. So open that up and select all of the item icons and drag and drop them into our item icons folder. Okay, so it's imported that. So that's all good to go. So head back out of the resources file. Then in here, we're going to right click and create a new folder and call this item meshes. In there, we're going to right click and create a new folder. This will be our item book. And then we're going to create another folder. This will be our item hatchet. And then one last folder for our item potion. So first open up our item book, then go to our project files, 3D models, book, and select all this and drag and drop it into our item book folder. It's going to ask us to import the FBX. We're just going to click import all. I'm going to leave all the settings as is. So click import all. It's going to say no smoothing group was found. That's okay. We can just click this X and that's fine. Then let's go back to our item meshes. Let's go to the next item, our item hatchet. Let's go to our 3D models, hatchet, select all the files in here and drag and drop it in our item hatchet folder. Again, it will pop up with the FBX import options. We'll just click import all. And that should be all good. Then lastly, let's go back to our item meshes and open up our item potion. Then go to our 3D models, potion, select the FBX and the texture, drag and drop it in the folder, click import all. It's going to say no smoothing group. Also texture name clash, that's okay. We can just close out of that. So now we can go ahead and set up all the materials. So first, let's go ahead and set up our item potion. So we have this potion material. So if we double click, open that up, we just need to drag in the texture. So we go back in our third person map, we have this texture. We can just drag and drop this into our material on the graph, hook up the RGB to the base color, and then we can delete this param. So save that, close out of there, and then we should have our potion item. Then let's go back to our item meshes. Let's go to item hatchet. We have this material for our hatchet, so double click, open that up, and then let's select our texture files. So all three of these, shift select those, drag that into our material, onto the graph, and we can delete this parameter. And we should have these three different textures. So the first one, we have this sort of wooden color. So we're going to take the RGB, plug that into the base color. Then this next one will be our metallic. So take the RGB and plug this into the metallic. And then this last one will be for our normal map. So take the RGB and plug this into the normal map. So then we can go ahead and hit save and close out of that. And that should be good for our hatchet. Then lastly, go to our item meshes, item book, and double click and open up the material. And let's shift select all the textures here. So we have all 4 of these, drag and drop them into our material graph. Let's delete the parameter here. So this red texture is our base color. So take the RGB, plug that into the base color. And this next one is the metallic. So take this one and plug this one into the metallic. Okay, and then we have the normal map. So take the blue texture and plug the RGB into the normal. And this last one, we're going to take the RGB and plug this into the ambient occlusion. So save that and close out of there. And now all of our items should be set up. So do a file, save all. And now we have our item book, our item hatchet, and our item potion. So now let's go ahead and set up the actual item blueprints. So if we go back to our main blueprints, we can open up our BP item book. So let's select the static mesh, and in the details we can change this to our book. So we have our book static mesh, and I'm actually going to scale this down. So it's a little bit too big. So I'm going to select the mesh and set this to 0.3 by 0.3. Compile and save. And if we look at our level, that should be good scale. And then also we want to set up the item info. So if we head over to the class defaults, under the default over here, if we expand this, we have that item info variable or the structure. And here we can actually set the variables relating to our BP item book. So the first thing is our item type enumeration. So we can hit this drop down and we can choose what type of item that this is. In our case, this is a readable. So it's a readable because it can be picked up and the player can read it and it'll have some sort of note or some sort of text. Then we want to set the mesh. So this will be our book, our static mesh book, because that is the static mesh. The damage, this won't have any damage, so we'll just leave that as 0. The item name, we're going to rename this to old book. Then we have item icon, so I'm going to click this drop down and change this to our T_book. So you should have a texture book. So this is the item icons that we imported from the project files. So that will be the item icon for our book. Then lastly, we have some text. So for this will actually be sort of like the text or note that when the player picks up this book, they can read it and see what's written inside of it. So in here, I'm going to write testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is some text inside of this book. So just some simple text. So compile and save, and now we set our variables or item info inside of our item book. So now let's go back to our content browser, and we want to create 2 more child classes of our item master. So we can right click this and create another child blueprint class, and this one will be called BP_item health potion. So double click, open that up, and in here we're going to select this static mesh and change this from the cube to our potion. So we should have this static mesh potion. So select that. We'll have that little tiny potion right there. I'm going to select the mesh and actually scale this up to 1 by 1 by 1, like that. And then let's go ahead and in the class defaults, under the item info, let's go ahead and actually set up the item info inside of here. So this is actually going to be consumable type. So when the player consumes this health potion, it will restore some health. For the mesh, we want to set this to our SM_potion or our potion static mesh. For the damage, instead of this actually doing damage, we're going to use this variable to restore health, okay? So if this is a potion or a health potion, instead of applying damage, we're going to restore health. So for the damage, I can use a variable of, say, 30. So we can set that to 30, and that will be how much health it will restore. So the variables inside of here are very flexible because you can use them any way that you want. In my case, I'm using the damage variable to restore health rather than item damage. Then we have item name, so I'm going to rename this to health potion. And then we have item icon, so hit the drop down and search for our texture T_potion. So this is our potion item icon. Then lastly, we have some item text, and we're actually not going to be using that, so that should be all set. And then let's go back over here and let's create one last child class. So right click the item master and again create a child blueprint class. And then this last item will be called BP_item hatchet. Okay, so double click, open that up, and in here we're going to set the static mesh. So first select the static mesh and change this to our hatchet. So we should have this hatchet static mesh. So it's very small, so we'll need to scale this up. So select the static mesh and set the scale. We can actually hit this little lock icon, and if we just set the scale on one of the axes, it will apply to all of them. So I'm going to set this to 3.5, and that should scale that all the way up. Okay, so that should be good. Compile, save that. Also in the class defaults, we need to go to the item info and change the settings in here. So in our case, we want to change this from item type consumable to an equipable, because we can equip this hatchet to our hand. Then for the mesh, we want to search for that hatchet mesh. So we have the hatchet static mesh. The damage, we could set this to something like 120. So we could do 120 damage. We have the item name, we can just name this to hatchet. We have the item icon, we can search for that T_hatchet. We have that item icon. And an item text, we'll just leave that blank. So compile, save, and now we should have all three of our items set up. So if we head back to our content browser, we have the item book, item hatchet, and the item health potion. So I'm actually going to delete this item master that's in our level, and then we can drag all three of these items out here. Okay, so we have our hatchet, we have our potion, and we have our book. Okay, so right now if I were to hit play and run up to these items, they don't really do anything. So we need to go ahead and set up the interaction logic so that when I run up to this item and I press E, we're going to go ahead and actually pick it up. So to do that, we want to go into our BP item master. So if we go into our master item, we're going to add the interaction logic inside of this blueprint class. That way it will apply for all of the children classes, okay? That way we don't have to individually set it up for each individual child class. Okay, if we just set it up in the master, it will inherit all of that logic. So in the event graph, we can actually delete these event be in plays. We don't need any of those. We're going to select the sphere. So this is the sphere collision. And in the event graph, if we scroll down in the details, we're going to add a event begin overlap. So click the plus icon there. So we have on component begin overlap for a sphere. We're going to select the sphere again and scroll down, and we should have on component end overlap. So make sure you have the on begin overlap and the on end overlap for our sphere. So we're going to do a check and see if the actor that is overlapping with this is our character. So again, this is our cast to third person character. And if it is our character, then we can go ahead and enable input. If it is not our character, then we can go ahead and disable input. So we're going to right click and get player controller and do a enable input. And actually want to take the target and plug this in for the player controller. And then we want to go ahead and do the same thing down here, except we want to disable the input. So when they leave the sphere, we want to disable input. So off the other actor, we want to cast to third person character. Then off our player controller, we want to do a disable input. I believe we actually want to hook this up to player controller. So hook that up like so. So when we overlap, we enable input. When we leave the sphere, we disable input. Then we just need to add a key that we can press so that when we press it, it will pick up the item. So up here at the top, we're going to right click and add a E key. So scroll down, we should have our E keyboard event. So when we press it, we want to, off of our other actor, cast to third person character. And then we actually want to add a pickup event inside of our character so that we can call that event and actually pick up the item. So that will sort of work as adding it or adding the item to our inventory so that our character can pick it up and equip it or consume the item, whichever logic that we set up. So we want to go to our third person character. And in here, we're actually using the E key already. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this, delete that E key. And down here on our third person character in our event graph, I'm going to right click and add a new event. So add custom event. And I'm going to rename this event to pick up item event. Then we can go ahead and add an input. So this is going to have one input. So in the details, add a new input, change this from a Boolean to the s_item structure. Okay, so we're going to change it from a Boolean to our s_item structure variable type. Then for the name, I'm going to rename this from new parameter to item info. So compile, save that. That should be good for now. So now we can call this pickup event. So if we head back over to our item master, because we're casting to our character, we can off of this blue pin, we can call that event. So if we drop that, we can call that pickup item event. So select that. And then for our item info, all we have to do is plug in our item info variable so that we can pass that variable to our pickup event, and that will go ahead and pass that info into our player character blueprint. So in our item master, let's drag into the graph our item info, get that in the graph, and then we can plug that into the item info, okay? Then the last thing that we want to do is we want to destroy this actor or delete this item from the level because our character is picking it up. So right after this, we're going to do a destroy actor. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and delete this from the level. So now if I go ahead and test this out, so if I hit compile and save, hit play, I should be able to run up to the items and press E. So when I overlap, I press E and pick it up. And you can see that it deletes it from the game. And right now it's not actually doing anything. It's just deleting the actor. It's not actually adding it to our player's inventory. So we need to actually create the player inventory array that will store all of the items. So if we head over to our BP third person character, we're going to create a new variable inside of our variables tab. So you want to click the plus icon and rename this to inventory array. And we want to change this from a Boolean to our s_item structure. So the item structure, it's the same variable that we have for this input here. And instead of having it as a single variable, we want to change this, hit the drop down and change this from single to an array. Okay, so we have an array of structures. So if we hit compile and save, we can now add our item info to our player's inventory array. So we're going to get our inventory array on the graph, and then we're going to drag and drop this on the graph and do a add. So we have under the utilities array, we have add. So if we select that, we can now hook up the execution. And then for our item info, we just plug that into the blue pin right there. And now it's going to add that item that we pick up to our inventory array. Okay. Now, if we were to actually test this out and hit play, we're not going to see anything happening visually. It's technically added to the array, but we don't really see anything happening. Now, to actually see something happen, what we can do to visualize this is if we want to actually see those items being added to this array, we can right click this inventory array. And if you right click it right on the pin, we can do watch this value. And what that will do is it will allow us to see the actual values being added to the array. So we want to hit this play icon up here. And then now that we're simulating this, under this no debug object selected, if you hit the drop down, you can see that we have this BP third person character spawn in. So we want to select that. So now you can see that we are watching the array of S structures, inventory array, of this BP third person character that spawn in. So if I move this side by side here, if I run up to the book and press E, you can see that we actually added an item to our array. So if I hover over this inventory array, you can see that we have this inventory array number equals 1. So we have one item in our array. So if you hit this little drop down, you can see the actual item variable inside of that array. So we have index 0. So if I expand this, you can see that we added that book that we picked up. So it's a readable. We have the mesh, that book, static mesh, the item name, old book, the icon, and all the text. So it's adding that item to our array. So we go back in here, and if I pick up the potion now, you can see that it also fired off there. So if I hover over this, you can see our array is now equal to 2. So we have 2 items in our array. So if I expand this, you can see I have item or index 0, which is that book. Then I have index 1, which is that consumable or the potion. So if I expand that, you can see this is the static mesh potion, the damage, the item name, health potion, the icon, all that stuff. So lastly, I could run up to the hatchet, pick that up, and then again, we can hover over our inventory array. It says number equals 3. So we know that we have 3 entries in this array. So if I expand that, we should have index 0, 1, and 2. So this last one is that hatchet item. So we have the hatchet static mesh. We have the name of the item, the hatchet, and then the item icon. So basically, if you watch the value and if you set your debug object selected, you can essentially see the values of the array at runtime. And this is super useful for not only seeing the contents of arrays, but for also debugging your blueprint. Okay. Now, if I press escape out of here, we can right click this and do stop watching this value. And then of course we can set this back to no debug object selected. But basically we know that the item is being picked up and it's being added to our inventory array. So now that we know that this is working and functional, we want to go ahead and add a user interface or a widget to represent our player's hotbar, so that when we pick up an item, it will show on the player's screen. So let's go to our content drawer. I'm going to dock this back in our layout, and I'm going to go back to the main folder and right click, create a new folder, and this will be called widget. So double click and open that up, and in here I'm going to right click and create a new user interface of the type widget blueprint, and we're going to select user widget. So I'm just going to name this to w_main widget or main HUD, and double click and open that up. So inside of here, this is basically the widget editor. Again, I'm not going to go too in depth about widgets in this video. I will be making a separate beginner tutorial covering over widgets more in depth, but we're going to keep this very simple. So first things first, we want to add a canvas panel. So we want to search up in this palette for canvas panel. So I want to take that and drag this onto our main widget. And that will basically give us a canvas to start working on. So we want to add a simple hotbar down here at the bottom that will consist of some item icons or some images that we can set as item icons when we pick up items. Okay, so it's sort of like any sort of hotbar that you see in an RPG game. So we're going to go ahead and first add a horizontal box. So we have panel, horizontal box. We drag that here on the canvas. We can take this and scale this up. I'm going to sort of center this in the middle like that. And then in there, I'm going to add a border. So search for border. We have this border. I drag that into the horizontal box. I'm going to select the border. And in the details, I'll set that to fill. And for the padding here, I'm going to set this value to 5. Okay. Then for the border, I'm going to change the actual color of this. So you want to change under the appearance, the brush color. You don't want to change the color and content and opacity. You want to change this brush color, because this will actually affect the contents inside of this border rather than the actual color of the border. So for the brush color, we want to change this to a black color, and then under the value, under the advanced here, so for our alpha, I'm going to change the value to 0.5. And that will add sort of this transparent value. So hit OK. Compile and save. And then onto that border, I want to add an image. So search for image. We have image and drag and drop it onto the border. Then select that image. And I'm going to give this a padding. So over in the details, I'm going to select the padding here and change this to 10. And then for the color and opacity, I'm going to change this to sort of this grayish tint. So compile and save that. And then I'm just going to copy this border. So select the border, copy, and paste it 2 more times. So you should have a total of 3 of these. So select our horizontal box. Let's actually scale this up a little bit. So something like this. This will be our simple hotbar of 3 items. And then I'm going to select the horizontal box right here. And for our anchors, if we go over to our anchors, we want to anchor this at the bottom center. Okay, so select the bottom center anchor. So it should anchor it down here at the bottom. Okay, so now we can compile and save this. And now we just need to add this to our player screen. So in our third person character, I'm going to right click and add custom event on our graph. And I'm just going to call this to create our main HUD. And then off of this execution, we can do a create widget. So select that, and for our widget or for the class, we want to search for our w_main widget. And for our owning player, we can drag off here and do a get player controller. So get player controller. Then we just want to add this to our viewport. So off the return value, we can do a add to viewport. Add to viewport. And then lastly, we want to save this main widget reference. So off this return value, we can promote that to a variable. And let's go ahead and rename this variable to widget reference. Okay, so we'll save a little reference to our main widget. So compile and save. Now we just need to call this create our main HUD event off of our event begin play. So if you scroll all the way over here to the top, under our add input mapping, go ahead and move this up. Off of our event begin play, we're going to do a sequence. So we're going to do a sequence, and that will give us some extra execution nodes. So for then 0, we're going to just do our add input mapping. Then for our then 1, we're going to drag off here and call our create our main HUD event. So off our event begin play, we'll add the input mapping, and then we'll create our main HUD all the way down here, which will create our main widget and add it to our viewport. So compile and save that, and if we hit play, we can now see our little hotbar down at the bottom of our screen. So now what we want to do is when we actually pick up an item, we want to show the item icon on our hotbar. So whenever we pick up items, we want to show it being added to our item hotbar. So the way that we're going to go about doing that is, first things first, we need to go to our main widget, and we need to, in our graph, add an event for changing the image to set it to our item icon. So first things first, we're actually going to rename these images. So I'm going to select this first image right here, and in the details, we can rename this to image 0. And then this next one right here, I'm going to select that, and this will be image 1. And then this last one over here will be image 2. So I'm just naming this to image 0, 1, and 2 because it will be the same index as our array. So for example, the array starts at index 0. So this will be the first item, or index 0. Then the second item, or index 1. Then the third item, or index 2. So now let's head over to our graph. And this will take us to our event graph inside of our widget. We have some of these events already in here, but I'm going to select and delete those. We don't need any of those. So I hit compile and save. And we want to add an event to set those images or to update those item icons. So I want to right click and add a custom event, add custom event, and this will be called update image. So we need to add some inputs inside of here so that we can know which image we want to set. So select that custom event, and in the details we should have inputs. So we can add a input. The first one will be a integer, and we'll rename this to item index. So we want to know which item index inside of our array are we updating for our widget. So for our item index, we want to do a switch on integer. And what the switch on integer does is we can add these pins. So we can add 3 pins total, and it will add a value. So we have value 0, 1, or 2. So it's sort of like a switch on enumeration, but in this case, it's switching on the different integer values. So we also want to add another variable or input for our update image event. So select that and add another variable. This will be of the type texture 2D. So we have texture 2D. We want to select the object reference. And then we want to rename this to item icon. So we want to pass through the item icon so that we can set the image icon. So now we just want to get these variables or these images. So these images are the images on our hotbar. So I want to get image 0 and get that on the graph. And then off of there, we can do a set brush from texture. So we have set brush from texture. So if we hook this up for switch on int 0, this will set image 0. And for the texture, we just plug in the item icon for the new texture. So basically, we're setting the image to that new item icon at the index. So we just want to do this for all the other images. So we want to get image 1 and also do a set brush from texture. And then we're going to plug that for index 1. And for the texture, we can plug in the item icon. We can also get image 2, get that on the graph, and do a set brush from texture. Hook that up for index 2. And for the texture, hook up the item icon. So compile and save. And now we should be able to call this update image when we add an item to our inventory. So if we head back over to our third person character, we want to go to our pickup event. So this is where we pick up the item. So now to actually call that update image event, what we want to do is we want to get our widget reference. So we saved a reference to our main widget. So we can drag off here and get it. Now I'm actually going to select this and move this down. But for our widget reference, we can call that update image. So update image event. So we have the item index. And then we also need to get the item icon. So the way that we can get that is off of our inventory array, we can do a get. So we have array get, so we can get a copy of that array. And the index that we want to use is wherever we add this new item at. So it returns the index of the newly added item. So we can take that and plug that into our get. And then off of the get, that returns the S item structure. So if you drag off of here, we can do a break S item structure. And then if we expand this, we now have the item icon. So for our update image, we want to hook up the execution. For the item index, we can hook up the item index like so. And then for the item icon, off of this break S structure, we can plug in the item icon to the item icon like so. So now what it's doing is it's adding the item to our inventory array. Then at that index, we're getting that. We're getting the item icon from it. And we're updating the image at that index. So now if we hit compile and save, let's go back to our third person map and hit play. If we run up to this book, if we press E, you can see that we picked up the book. It's added to our array. And you can see on our hotbar, we set that image at index 0 to that book icon. So I go up to this potion, I press E. You can see that at index 1, we set the item icon to that potion image. Then lastly, we can go up to our hatchet, press E, and you can see we have our hatchet item on our hotbar. So we set up a simple hotbar, and we can actually pick up the items, and it will show it on our hotbar. Now what I want to set up is a simple selection system. So basically, when I scroll my mouse wheel up or down, I want to highlight the item that I have selected on my hotbar. So first things first, let's actually head over to our main widget. And the same sort of thing that we did with this update image, we want to do it for our borders right here. So we have these borders, and basically I want to change the color of this border to be yellow if we have that item selected. So the first thing that we need to do is set these borders as variables. So if you select the border, you want to check is variable in here, and that will actually allow us to use it here on the graph. So now you can see we have border 72. So we head back over to the designer. I'm going to rename this. So this will be border 0. Then select this second border. We're going to rename this, change that to a variable, and rename this to border 1. And then select this last one right here, change that to a variable. This will be border 2. So compile, save that, head over to the graph, and in here, right below our update image, we can right click, add custom event, and rename this to select item. And we want to add a new input, and this will just be a integer, and we'll rename this to selected index. So sort of the same thing up here, or the item index that we have selected. And again, we want to do a switch on integer. So we want to do a switch on int. And we want to add those 3 pins, so 0, 1, and 2. And in our case, we want to set the borders to sort of a yellow tint. So if we get border 0, we can get that on the graph. We're going to drag up here and do a set brush color. So we have set brush color. Hook that up for 0, and we can change this color to sort of this yellow tint like that. Click OK, and then we can copy this set brush color and paste it 2 more times. Hook this up like so. And for these other brush colors, we want to get border 1, hook that up for the target, and then we want to get border 2 and hook that up like so. Okay, so depending on the item we have selected, we'll set the brush color of the border to this yellow tint, and that will sort of give it like this highlighted effect. Okay, so now we need to add the logic to select an item. So for that, we'll head to our third person character, and we want to add a scroll wheel event. So if I scroll up, it will cycle through the items. If I scroll down, it will cycle backwards. Okay, so in our third person character, we want to add the scroll up and the scroll down for our mouse. So you want to right click and search for mouse wheel up. So we have mouse events, mouse wheel up, and then we also have mouse wheel down. So mouse events, mouse wheel down. Then we want to add a couple of variables to keep track of our selected index on our hotbar. So we want to, under the variables, add a new variable and name this to selected index, and changes from an array to a single, and changes from the structure to a integer. Okay, so compile and save that. And then we also want to add another variable and call this max inventory slots. Okay, for however many inventory slots that we have on our hotbar. So compile and save that. Now for this max inventory slots, we want to set a default value. So select that. The default value will be 2. Because again, this is a array, so it starts at index 0. So we have 0, 1, and 2. So compile and save. So for our mouse wheel up event, we're going to do a check. The check that we want to do is we want to get our selected index, get that on the graph, and also get our max inventory slots. So we're going to check and see if our selected index is equal. So we have operator equal to our max inventory slots. So off of here, we can do a branch, and then we can hook that up for our pressed for our mouse wheel up. Okay, if it is equal to our max inventory slots, that means we can't scroll any further up. If it is not, then we can go ahead and increment our selected index. So you want to get the selected index, and off of there, we can do a increment. So we have increment integer, and that will add 1 to our selected index variable. Plug it up for the false. And then to visualize this, we could do a print string. So do a print string. And we'll just hook up this value to our string, okay, just to see what it looks like. Then for our mouse wheel down, we want to check and see if our selected index is equal. And for this, we just want to check and see if it's equal to 0, because then we can't scroll any further down. So we do a branch. So if it is equal to 0, we don't want to do anything because we can't scroll any further down. But if it is not equal to 0, then we can go ahead and scroll down. So we want to get our selected index and do a decrement. So decrement integer, select that, hook that up for false, and then we want to print that to our screen. So do a print string and hook up the value to our print string, okay? So compile and save that. So now if I scroll up, we should see the value of our selected index, and we should see it go all the way up to 2, and then all the way back down to 0. So if I hit play, I can scroll up. You can see it goes all the way to 2, and if I scroll all the way down, it goes down to 0. Selected index is 1, 0. I can go from 0 to 1, then 2. Okay, so you can see I can scroll up or down, and it changes the value or the selected integer variable. So now we can take that and feed that into our widget to change the border and set that brush color to whatever index that we have selected. So in our third person character, we can just call that event that we created in our widget. So we want to get our widget reference on the graph, and we have that select item event. So plug that in like so. And then for the selected index, we can take this value and plug that in for the selected index. Again, we want to do the same thing down here. So take this, copy and paste it, hook that up. And for the selected index, again, off of this decrement, we can plug that in for our selected index. So compile and save. Now what we're going to see is when I scroll, you can see that it changes the color of the border, but it's not resetting the other ones back to the default color. Okay, so now it's all selected. So we want to go ahead and fix that. So in our main widget, under our select item event, before we set the brush color to yellow, we want to reset all of the other borders back to the default color. So we're actually going to take all of this and move this over. So before we do anything, we want to set a brush color. So I'm going to copy and paste this over here. And for this brush color, we're going to set this to a default color of black, and then change the alpha to 0.5 and click OK. So that is the color that we have set as the default for our border here. So we want to set or reset our borders before we set the brush color. So for this first one here, we want to set borders 1 and 2 to this black tint, and then set border 0 to the yellow. So copy borders 1 and 2, plug that in for the target. Let's plug in our execution. And then for this, we can set border 0 to yellow. Then for 1, we want to reset 0 and 2. So copy and paste those. We can unhook these and copy and paste our set brush color. So we're resetting brushes 0 and 2 before we set border 1 to yellow. And then lastly, for border 2, we want to reset borders 0 and 1. Okay, so copy and paste that down here, and then copy and paste our set brush color. Hook that up for 2. Hook up border 0 and 1, so we're resetting that before we're setting the brush color of border 2 to yellow. So we're basically resetting the other borders to the default color before we're setting the selected border to the yellow tint. So compile and save. Let's go ahead and hit play. And now you can see I can scroll up or down, and you can see which index we have selected. We have index 0 selected, 1 or 2, or we can scroll all the way back down to 0. So it sort of gives us this selected effect. Okay, so we have the ability to pick up items, and then we can also move our mouse wheel up and down and pretty much select which item that we want to use. Now what we want to add is we want to add the ability to actually use items. So if I select this potion, I want to be able to left click with my mouse button and use it. Also, I want to give the character the ability to swap items. So for example, if I were to run up to this book, I want to pick it up on my hotbar where I have it selected. And also I want to go ahead and swap items out. So for example, if I have my book item selected here, if I pick up the potion, I want to swap my book for the potion. So we're going to go ahead and implement that logic now. So let's go to our third person character blueprint. And in the event graph, over here up at our pickup event, we're actually going to move this pickup event logic into a function. So there's actually two different ways that we can do that. We can create a function in here, or you can select all of the code and right click and do collapse to function. So if we do collapse to function, what that will do is it'll go ahead and create a new function for us, and it will also add an input for whatever nodes that we have hooked up. So you can see it added automatically this input of the type S item structure, and we can go ahead and rename this function to add item. And then for this input, we can rename this. We can just leave that as new item. That's fine. And so in this function, if we double click and open up, you can see that it has all of the logic that we had outside of it. We have the add item. We're taking that new structure, adding it to our inventory array, and we're updating the image on our hotbar. Now, this all works pretty much the same as what we set up, but what we want to set up is the ability to swap an item so that basically before we add the item, we check and see, do we already have an item at that index? And then if so, we'll swap the item and spawn the other one back into the world. So we're actually going to go ahead and delete all this so we can start out fresh. So delete that and compile save. So first things first, let's actually select our inventory array, and we're going to give this 3 array elements. So we have index 0, 1, and 2. So we have a total of 3 different array elements. Now the reason why we want to have these array elements is because we're going to set them rather than add array elements. So it's sort of like setting a cap on how many slots we have in our inventory. So now to actually set these array elements, we're going to get our inventory array, and we're going to use the node set array element. Okay, so this array set array element. So this specific node allows us to set a specific index that we have in our inventory. So for example, I'm going to hook this up to our execution, and for the index, we want to hook up our selected index. So this is the index that we have selected. So get that on the graph and hook that up for the index. For the item, this is the S item structure. So plug in the new item for that item. And then lastly, we just want to update the image. So we want to get our widget reference and update our hotbar image. So call that update image function. And then for the item index, we can plug in the selected index. And for the item icon, we want to, off of our new item, we want to break S item structure and expand this and plug in the item icon for the item icon. So compile and save. So now we've set up a pickup logic that picks up the item at the specific index that we have selected. So for example, if I hit play, if I move my mouse cursor to index 2 at the very right, if I pick up the book, you can see that it picks it up at that selected index, okay? So I could select the first index or index 0, pick up the potion, it'll be added there, and then the last one, I'll select it here. Now this also works for swapping, so technically I could pick up the book at the first index and then pick up the potion, and now you can see that it sort of swaps that item out. But what we need to add is we need to spawn back the item that we swapped out and drop it back in the world. So the way that we're going to do that is by spawning that actor back into level. We actually need to modify our item structure and add another variable type inside of here. Okay, so we need to go back to our content drawer, stock that in layout. Let's go to our structures and double click and open up our item structure. And so we're going to add that one last variable that I was talking about. So add a new variable in here, and this will be of the type BP underscore item, BP item master. And instead of an object reference, we want to select the class reference. Okay, so select class reference. So it should be BP item master class reference. Then just rename this to item class. So now save that. Now if we go back into our third person character, we now have that item class reference. So we're going to use this to actually spawn the item back in the level. And also we're going to check and see if we have an item inside of our inventory array, if that class reference is valid. So actually we need to recompile the blueprint so that we have that new structure variable. So we have the item class. So basically, before we do anything, we want to do a check and see if the item that we're adding at that selected index, if there's an item set inside of here. So the way that we'll do that is we'll check and see if the item class is set to none or if there's something actually in there. So first, for our add item, we're going to get our inventory array, do a get a copy, and we want to get it at our selected index. So get this selected index and hook that up. And then we want to break the structure. So do a break s item structure, expand this, and we want to get the item class. And off of there, we'll do a is valid class. Okay. So we'll check it and see if it's a valid class. And if so, we'll do a branch. And let's hook this up for the condition. So basically, if this is false, then we'll just add an item. So I'll actually just plug this into our set array element, because we don't have to spawn any item back into the world. But if this is true, that means that there is an item at that inventory slot in our inventory array. So that means that we have to go ahead and swap the item or spawn it back in the world. So we're going to do a spawn actor from class, and then we can hook up the class from our item class, and that will go ahead and spawn that actor into the world. Now we have to give a spawn transform of where we want to spawn the item. So what I'm going to do is in our viewport, I'm going to spawn it in front of our character. So I'm going to select our character and add a new component. So let's click the add icon and search for a arrow. So we have arrow component. Select that and move that forward. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. So it should spawn the item sort of right in front of the character. So compile, save. It's giving us this error. Let's go back to our add item function. Okay, it wants a spawn transform. So we're just going to right click the spawn transform and do split structure pin. Then if we compile and save, you can see that error goes away. But we need to hook up a location. So we want to get that arrow component that we just added. Get that on the graph, and then we want to get the location. So drag up there and get world location. Okay, so transformation, get world location. So plug the return value into the spawn transform location, and that will go ahead and spawn that item back into the world. And then of course, after that, we want to go ahead and set the array element. So we can go ahead and add the item at that index. So that is our add item. So to recap, we are getting the item at our selected index. We're checking to see if there's an item inside of there, if there's a valid class. If so, we're spawning the item that we have at that index back into the world. And then we're going to go ahead and add the item that we're picking up at that array element. Now, if we were to test this out, it's not actually going to spawn the item back into the world because we haven't set our item class reference. So we need to go ahead and set that item class reference. So we want to go to our blueprints and to our items, and we want to open up our item health potion. And once you open it up like this, sometimes when you open up a blueprint, it will show this view, which is just the default value. So if you want to go back to the default blueprint view, you can click this open full blueprint editor, and that will pull up the normal blueprint editor view that we're accustomed to. Now in the class defaults under the item info, we actually want to recompile our master blueprint. So head over to your BP item master and hit compile and save. And now if we head back over to the children class or the item health potion, we can now see we have that item class variable inside of our item info. So for the item class, we want to hit this drop down, and we just want to set it basically to itself. So for this item health potion, we want to set it to our item BP item health potion. So it's basically like setting a class reference to itself. And then we want to go ahead and do this for all the other blueprints. So we have our item hatchet, so double click, open that up. And we can also edit the class defaults or the item info inside of this view. So in this item info under the item class, we can hit this drop down, and this is our item hatchet. So we want to set it to our BP item hatchet, compile and save that, close out of there. And then we want to get our item book, and in the item class we want to hit the drop down and set it to our BP item book. So hit compile and save, and now that should be good to go. So now if we go ahead and hit play, we should be able to pick up an item. So I'm going to pick up this book at the first index, and then if I pick up this potion, you can see that it swaps it out and spawns that item back into the world. So I have the potion on my hotbar, and I have the book spawn in the world. So if I go back to the book and press E, you can see that I swapped the potion for the book. The potion is spawned back in the world. And I can do this for other items like the hatchet and swap that out like that. Now I want to add a little bit of physics to these items so that they're not just floating in the world. So if we go to our item master, our BP item master class, we can select the static mesh, and in the details we can hit simulate physics. So we're simulating physics for our static mesh component. So now if we hit compile and save and go back into the world, you can see that our items have physics. So I can go ahead and pick up this book, and then if I swap it out for the potion, you can see that it has sort of this drop effect. So it has sort of physics enabled, and we can swap out the items like so. So now we have a basic item swapping logic. Now what I want to add is the actual ability to use the items. So for example, when I click on this health potion, I want to consume the item and say restore some health. If I click on this book, I want to pull up the text so I can actually read the text. And then if I pick up this hatchet and click on it on my hotbar, I want to be able to equip a hatchet item to our player's hand. So let's go ahead and set up the use item logic so we can actually use the items on our hotbar. So let's go to our third person character and into our event graph. And what we want to add is a left mouse button. So basically when I click on my left mouse button, we're going to use the item at that hotbar index. So I'm going to right click and search for left mouse button. So we have mouse events, left mouse button. Now we want to add a function called use item. So let's add a new function and name this to use item. And we're going to add an input and change this input type to our item structure. So we have our S item structure, and I'm going to rename this to item info. So compile and save that. Now in our event graph, if we go back to the event graph, we can call that use item function and hook that up for the pressed. And then to get the item info at our selected index, we want to get our inventory array and do a get. So array get a copy. And then we want to get it at our selected index. So get the selected index and plug that in. And then for the output, we can plug that in for our item info. So basically when we left click our mouse button, it's going to get that item at our array index or wherever we have it selected on our hotbar. Then it will feed that into our use item function. So we can double click, open that up. And so inside our use item, we want to drag off here and do a break S item structure. And now that's where this item type enumeration comes handy. So off of this item type, we can do a switch on E item type. And now we can set up different logic depending on whatever item type it is. So if it's a consumable, I can consume the item. If it's equipable, I can equip the item to my player's hand. And if it's a readable, I could show some text on the player's screen. So let's hook up the execution pin here. So now what we want to do is we want to, instead of putting all the logic inside of here, we're actually going to add some functions. That way it'll keep everything nice and clean. So I'm going to add a new function called consume item. And then we're going to have a input. So add a new input. It'll be of the type S item structure. And we'll just rename this to item info. And then let's go ahead and add another function. This will be called equip item. And we'll have another input of the type S item structure. And just rename that to item info. Okay, and then add one last function. This will be called read item. And then add another input of the type S item structure. And just rename that again to item info. So compile and save and head back to the use item function. So in here we can call those functions. So you can actually put a function inside another function. So for example, I can call my consume item function inside of the use item function. So I can get my consume item, hook that up for my consumable. And then for the item info, we can plug in the item info like so. So we just want to do this for all of our other functions. So get our equip item function, hook that up for the equipable, and plug in our item info. And lastly, call our read item function, hook that up for the readable, and plug in our item info to the item info like so. So now, depending on the item type, we will call a different function depending on the item type enum. So if it's a consumable, we'll call the consume item function. If it's equipable, we'll call the equipable item function, and so on. So now we need to set up these functions. So first things first, let's go ahead and set up our consume item function. So let's double click and open that up. That will open up the consume item function. And in here, basically what the consume item function will do is we're going to add sort of a health variable to our player, and it will restore some health to our player's health bar. So we're going to consume that potion item, and it will just restore some health to our player. So first things first, we need to actually add a health variable for our player so we can keep track of the player's health. And we're actually going to be adding a health bar as well later on. But first, let's add a variable for our health. So a new variable, and this will be called health. And we want to change this to a float. So compile and save that. And now in the default value, we can set this to, let's actually set this to 10. So we don't want it to be 100 HP because the consume item will restore health. So I'm just going to set our player's health to 10. And then for our consume item, we want to get our item info and do a break s item structure and expand this. So we have this damage variable. Now for our consume item, we're actually going to be using this damage variable as the variable to restore health. Because we set that early on in this tutorial, we were using the damage for the amount of health to restore. So we're going to get our health variable on the graph. We're going to do a add. So we have operators add, and we're going to add that by the amount of damage. So take that and add that like so. And then we just want to clamp this because we don't want the player to restore more than 100 HP for their health. So off of this, I'm going to do a clamp float. So we have this clamp float, and the minimum will be 0 and the maximum will be a value of 100. So we can't heal more than 100 HP. Then we just want to set our health. So get our health and do a set, hook that up for the value. And then we just want to hook up our execution pin like so. And then we could finally just print this off to our screen for now. So do a print string and hook up the health into the end string. Then lastly, we want to go ahead and remove the item from our inventory. So basically when we consume an item, we want to remove the item because we consumed it. So it's like a one-time use only. So to do that, to clear that inventory array, we want to get our inventory array on our graph, and we're going to do a set array element. So set array element, and for the index, we want to hook up our selected index. And instead of hooking up anything to this item, we're just going to leave this as blank. And what that will do is it will set all the values to nothing. Okay, it will basically reset that array element to an empty array element. And then lastly, we want to actually update the item icon on our hotbar, because if we were to consume this item, it's going to remove the item at that inventory array, but we need to actually update the item icon on our widget. So let's go to our W main widget and go to the graph, and we need to add a event that will remove the item or reset this image back to the default if we delete that item. So in our graph, we want to right click and add a custom event, and this will just be called remove image, and we want to add a input of the type integer and rename this to selected index. So compile, save, and just like we were doing up here, we want to do a switch on integer. So do a switch on int, and then we want to add those 3 indexes, so index 0, 1, and 2, and then basically we just want to set the image back to the default style or just reset it. So if we get our image 0 on the graph, we can do a set brush from texture. So set brush from texture. And if we just leave this as empty, that will just reset the image to the default style. So hook that up for index 0. So we're setting the brush for index 0. Then we want to get image 1 and do a set brush from texture and hook that up for index 1. And then lastly, we want to get image 2 and again do a set brush from texture and hook that up for index 2. So we're basically just resetting the image back to this default style, depending on whichever index we have selected. So now we can just call this remove image in our third person character. And in our consume item function, we just want to get our widget reference. So get our widget reference, and then we can call that remove image function. And then for our selected index, we just plug in our selected index, okay? So that will go ahead and ensure that we remove the image or reset the image wherever we're consuming an item on our hotbar. So now we should be able to test this out. So in our event graph, basically what we set up is our left mouse button. So when I click on my hotbar at the selected index, it's going to get that array element at the selected index and call our use item function. It's going to pass that item info over. And depending on the item type that we have selected, say it's a consumable, it's going to call our consume item function and again pass that item info into that function. And then with that item info, we're going to get things like the damage, which is technically how much health we should restore. We're going to get our health variable, which is 10, and add that amount that we want to restore. We're going to make sure that we clamp the value and not restore more than 100 HP. We'll set that and print it off to the screen. And then finally, we're going to delete that item array element or reset it back to an empty array, and then remove the image on our widget so that we can see that we removed that item or we consume that item. So now if we hit play, we can run up to our potion and pick that up. Now if I click left mouse button, you can see that our value is 40 up at the top left. And so we started at 10 HP, but we restored 30. So you can see our total HP is 40. And also remove the item at our selected index. So let's actually add a health bar widget so we can visualize our potion restoring health. But as you can see, it removed the item from our hotbar, and we know that that is all working. So to add our health bar, we're going to actually go to our main widget and designer. And this is going to be the same exact way that we added our health bar in our Blueprint for Beginners video. So in our palette, we're going to search for a progress bar. So we're going to select the progress bar and just drag it onto our canvas panel, and we can just scale this up. Okay, and the percent, so in the details, if you have it selected, this percent is what actually drives the progress bar percent. So you can see a value of 1 is full HP, 0.5 is about half HP, and all that stuff. So first things first, let's actually anchor this to our bottom left part of our screen. So make sure you select the progress bar, and in the anchors up here, we want to anchor it to the bottom left part of our screen. Then we want to just bind this percent to the health values in our player. So to do that, over here we have this nice bind button. So for our percent, we can click this drop down and create a binding. So click on that. What that will do is it will create this function, get percent, and it will return the value right here. So we can basically set up inside of this function, get our player's health and return it as a value here, and it will go ahead and bind that to our percentage for our health bar. So we want to right click and get owning player pawn. And then from there we can cast to our character. So we can do a cast to third person character. And for our third person character, we can just get our health. So get health. So default get health. And for our return value, we don't want to actually plug this in because this is a value from 0 to 100. And our percent is a value of 0 to 1. So we need to basically shift the decimal point over so that we can have this be clamped at a value of 0 to 1. So we can do a multiply. So operator multiply, and we can multiply this by 0.01 and plug that into the return value, and then just hook up our execution pin like so. So compile, save, and now if we head back to our designer, we should be good to go. So let's hit play. We have our health bar. You can see that we're currently at 10 HP. So let's go ahead and pick up this potion. If I consume it, you can see that we now consume that health potion and it restored 30 HP. So we're sitting at a total of 40 HP on our health bar. We'd even get this health potion and duplicate it a couple more times. So if you hold Alt on your keyboard and drag, that will go ahead and duplicate the item. So I'm going to duplicate it 2 more times, hit play. Go ahead, run up to it and consume it. And pick this up and consume it again. And then again, pick this up and consume it. So now we're at 100 HP. So that is our consume item function. So we can consume our health potion and it will restore some health to our player's health bar. Now let's go ahead and set up the other functions for our item readable and also our equipable item like our hatchet. So let's go back to our third person character and to our use item function. So we need to set up our equip item. So let's go ahead and set that up next. So double click and open that up. And in here, what we want to do is we basically just want to attach the hatchet to our player's hand. So the way that we can do that is off of this item info, we can do a break S item structure and expand this. And we have this static mesh or this mesh variable that we can use. So now we want to go ahead and actually add a static mesh. So if we head over to the viewport, we want to add a static mesh component for our character. That way we can attach that to our player's hand. So in our viewport here, in the components, let's actually select our character's mesh and add a static mesh component. And we can just rename this to weapon and then just compile and save that. And then if we head back over to our equip item function, we can get that static mesh component or our weapon and do a set static mesh. So we have static mesh, set static mesh, and we can basically set that mesh to the mesh of the item that we're equipping. So hook up the execution pin like so. And then finally what we want to do is we want to attach this weapon to our player's hand. And so to do that, we're going to use the attach component to component. So we want to get our weapon component and do a attach component to component. So for the target component, that will be our weapon. For the parent, that will be our mesh. So you want to get our mesh, plug that in like so. Then for the socket name, we want to actually add a socket. So sockets are again what you'd use to attach things like weapons, armor, any sort of equipable to your player. So we need to go to our player character. So head over to the viewport and select your character mesh. And to browse to that, we can go to the details and click on this little browse icon for our skeletal mesh asset. And then we can double click to open that up. So that will go ahead and pull up the skeletal mesh editor. And then we want to head over to the skeleton. So click on this little skeleton icon. That will pull up the actual skeletal mesh and all the bones. So over here on the left, we can see all the different bones that make up this skeleton. And in our case, we want to look for the hand R bone or the right hand bone. So it should be this hand underscore R. And so with our hand R selected, we can right click and select this add a socket. And I'm going to rename this hand R socket. So double click on that. I'm going to rename this to weapon socket. And then we can actually add the hatchet to this so we can modify the scaling and location. So right click that weapon socket and we should be able to add a preview asset. And over here we can search for a hatchet. So we have that static mesh hatchet. As you can see, it's very tiny, so we can actually scale this up. I'm going to decrease my camera speed here. So I'm going to press R on the keyboard. And now I can scale this hatchet up. I can press E to rotate. I can rotate this 90 degrees. I press W, I can move it around. So basically, I'm going to sort of move it like this. sort of place it in the character's hand. And I'm going to turn off rotation snapping. So if I rotate it, should get a more smoother placement. And we're just going to, roughly place it in the character's hand, something like that. So save that. We're going to copy the weapon socket name. So double click and copy this. And let's go back to our third person character and into our equip item function. And now we should be able to type in or paste that socket name that we're going to use. So I'm going to paste in the weapon socket like so. And for our location rule, I'm going to change this from keep relative to snap to target, and snap to target. Okay. So for location, rotation, and scale, we'll just do snap to target. So compile, save that. Now we should be able to see this work in action. So we're equipping the item, we're setting the mesh component, and then we're attaching that to our player's hand at the weapon socket. So let's go ahead and hit play here and run up, pick up our hatchet. And then if I left click, you can see that we now equip that hatchet to our player's hand because we're setting that static mesh component and we're attaching it to that weapon socket that's on our player's hand. Okay. Now one thing that you're going to notice is if I try and equip this other book, you can see that we still have the hatchet equipped to our hand. So no matter what item I swap out, you can see that we still have that hatchet equipped. So just a little bug that we're going to have to fix. So let's go ahead and actually fix that right now. So let's go to our third person character. And to fix that little bug, we just want to go to our add item function. And basically, if we have a item equipped, we want to do a little extra check to see if we have that hatchet equipped. And then if so, we can dequip that hatchet. To do that off of this true. So if it is a valid class, that means that we have an item in our inventory slot that we're picking up. Then we want to do an additional check to see if that item is an equipable item. So let's go ahead and actually select all of this and move this over. So that additional check, we just want to get the item type and check and see if that is equal. So do a enum equal enum. We want to see if that is equal to a equipable item. So off of this true, we can do another branch. Do a branch. Let's hook that up for the true. So if that is true, that means that we have an equipable item equipped. If it is not true, for the false, we can just plug it back into our spawn actor. So now we want to add a dequip item function up here that will basically just reset this weapon mesh to nothing. So let's add quickly a new function. So click add function. Just call this dequip item. And then in here, this will be really simple. We're going to get our weapon mesh and do a set static mesh. Okay, so we're just going to set the static mesh, and rather than plugging anything in here, we're going to leave that as empty. So that will basically just reset the weapon mesh to be empty. So compile, save that. Let's go back to that add item function. And now we can call that dequip item. So drag and drop that on the graph. And then for the true, we can hook that up, dequip the item. And then of course you want to plug that back into the spawn actor so we can continue to swap out the item and add the item that we're picking up. So now we should be fixing that bug that we have with our equipped item. So if we hit compile, save, hit play, I can pick up the hatchet, equip it. So if I click on it, that'll equip the item. And if I go and swap it out for a book, you can see that it dequips the item from our hand. And again, I can pick up the hatchet and re-equip it, or swap it out for a potion, and you can see that it dequips that item. So just a little bug that we can fix by dequipping the item first before we pick it up. Now the last item that we want to set up is our readable item. So when I pick up this book and I left click, we want to basically have sort of a little widget that looks like a book on our screen with some text that we can read from our item book. So let's go back to our third person character and go back to our use item function. So we set up the consume item, the equip item. Now let's go into our read item function. So double click and open that up. Now in here, what we want to do is we need to actually go ahead and add that book widget inside of our main widget. So let's go to our W main widget. And in here, we're going to add a simple book widget or a little border that sort of looks like a book, and then just some text inside of it. So let's go ahead and search for a vertical box. So we have vertical box. Let's go ahead and drag that onto our canvas panel and scale this up. Move this around like so. And then we're going to add a multi-line, and we're going to add a text box multi-line. So drag that and drop that into the vertical box. Actually, first things first, select the vertical box. So make sure you have that vertical box selected, and we're going to anchor this to the center. That way it'll be in the center of the player's screen. Then select the multi-line editable text box. We want to set that to fill, so it'll fill the entire box. Then for the text, we can type in, test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, testing this multi-line text box. Okay, so you can just put in a bunch of random text. We actually can barely see that text on there, so we need to change the style. So for the style, you can go into the details and expand the style. And then over here, we want to change things like the foreground color, background color, and all that stuff. So I believe the foreground color, if we change that, that actually changes the color of the text. So I'm going to set that to a white color. And then for the background, I'm going to change this to a black tint. So it should be like that. Then we want to go ahead and scale up this font because it's a little bit tiny. So for the font style, we want to go to this text style, expand that. We have font. I'm going to change the font family to this font that we have here. And then I'm going to scale up the font size. You can change the size. I'm going to leave that as 26. I think that should be good. So as you type more words in here, you can see that the text wraps. So I can do testing the text wrapping on this box. So you can see this allows us to have multiple lines, and so this will be perfect for our book text. Okay, so compile and save that. Now if we were to hit play, this widget is going to be shown by default. Now we don't want that to happen. We want to have it be shown if the player left clicks on the book on their hotbar. So let's go back to our main widget. Now to show or hide this widget, we're going to actually head over to the graph, and we can close out of this get percent function. So you can close out of that and head over to the actual event graph. And so we can basically get that multi-line text box on our graph and set that to visible or hidden. Also, we want to edit the text because we want to set the text to the text that we have inside of our book item or item book. So on the graph, we want to add a custom event. Add custom event, and this will be called open book. And this will have one input of the type text, and just rename this to book text. Okay. So compile, save that. We want to get our multi-line editable text box on the graph, and then we can do a set text. And if you scroll down, we have this widget set text multi-line text box. Okay, so this is the one that we want. Then for the in text, we can just plug in the book text like so. And then lastly, we want to make this visible on the screen. So we want to get our multi-line text box and set this to visible. So under the widget visibility, we want to set visibility, and we want to set that to visible. Now by default, we also want to set that to hidden. So in the designer, we want to select the multi-line text box, and in the details panel, if you scroll all the way down to behavior, we should have this visibility. We're going to set this to hidden by default. So this multi-line text box, we're going to set that to hidden. And then in the graph, we have that open book event that will set that to visible. Now we also want to add a close book or hide book event that will basically set that to hidden. So down here, we're going to right click, add custom event. This will be called hide book. And then for this, we're just going to get our multi-line text box and call the set visibility widget set visibility and set that to hidden. So the open book will set the text, set that to visible. The hide book will just set that back to hidden. So compile, save that, and we now have our book widget set up. So now we just need to call those events inside of our third person character and in our read item function. So in our read item function, we're going to add actually a new variable. So in the variables, let's add a new variable and call this is book open ? And change this from a float to a boolean. So compile and save that. Basically, we want to keep track of whether or not our book is open or closed, or whether or not it's shown on the screen. So I'm going to get that is book open boolean, and off of here we'll do a branch. Hook that up like so. Okay, and if it is open, we'll hide the book. If it is not open, we'll open the book. Okay. So to actually open the book, we want to get our widget reference and call that event that we created. So let's get our widget reference and call the open book function. So hook that up for the false. Then for the book text, we can, off of our item info, do a break s item structure. And if we expand this, we should have item text. So for our item book, we typed in this item text. And so we're going to use that for our book text. Then for our hide book up here, we want to again get our widget reference. So get that and call our hide book. So hook that up for the true. And then lastly, we just want to set this boolean to false up here and true if we have it open. So get our is book open and set that. So if we are opening the book, we're setting our is book open to true. If we're hiding the book, we're setting our is book open back to false, okay? And that will allow us to open or close the book. So sort of like a toggle. So compile and save that. So now we should be able to test this out. So when we use the item, we're going to call our readable or read item function. We're going to check and see if the book is open. If it is not open, we're going to call the open book inside of our widget, which will basically set it or set the widget to visible, and then also set the text of that multi-line text box to the book text. So now let's go ahead and hit play. Let's go run up to our book and press E to pick it up. If I equip it, you can see testing 1, 2, 3. This is some text inside of this book. If I click on it again, that will go ahead and hide the book text. So basically that is our simple readable item. I can toggle it to read the contents of the book, and I can hide it to hide the contents of that book. So that is pretty much all of the different items that we've set up. We set up our hatchet item that we can equip. We can swap it out for our potion. We can consume our potion item and that will restore health. And then we have our readable item that will pull up a simple book widget with some text inside of it. So to recap, in this video we covered over some of the different data-driven variable types inside of Unreal Engine, things like enumerators, structures, and arrays. We went over what are functions and how to use them to save time and optimize our blueprint graph. And we also applied all of that knowledge by creating a simple inventory system that features different pickup items, things like a hatchet that we can equip, a potion that restores health, and a book item that we can read. All of the items are designed to inherit pickup logic from the master class, which is the preferred design method for blueprints. Now, this is the second video in my Blueprint for Beginner series, and I will be making a follow-up video or a third and final video for this series called Blueprint for Advanced Users. So in the Blueprint for Advanced Users video, we will cover over some more advanced topics, things like what are blueprint interfaces and how to effectively use them, and so much more. So if you don't want to miss out on that video, make sure that you hit the subscribe button with the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Also, leave a like on the video and comment down below if there is something in particular that you want me to cover in my Blueprint for Advanced Users video or in any future tutorial here on the channel. Also, if you appreciate the free tutorial series and if you are eager to learn more, I recommend you check out my premium courses on my website, smartpoly.teachable.com. If you are interested in making games inside of Unreal Engine, luckily for you, I have a complete multiplayer survival game course, where we create a complete multiplayer survival game from scratch. And I will be adding more courses in the future, so chances are if you're watching this video in the future, you can check out my website, smartpoly.teachable.com, to check and see if there's any new courses. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.